Hey guys, let's talk a little bit more about rhetoric. So for this exercise, you are going to need your Unit 5 packet. In your Unit 5 packet on page 3, you are going to find this article that's titled, What is Rhetoric? There's a banner at the top that says Understanding Rhetoric. So we've kind of talked a little bit about rhetoric, kind of got our feet wet, gotten a little bit of an introduction. Now we want to look at some articles, some videos that help us better understand exactly what rhetoric is and how we're going to use it as part of our research process and the process of putting together both our written response to our research, but also the video project we'll be working on. So you're going to need something to write with, either a pen, a pencil, or a highlighter, because as we're going through this article on page 3, we're going to be taking some notes. There's a couple of reasons why we're doing that. One is because the notes are going to help us a little bit later on, especially as we get into some more definitions of elements of rhetoric and different types of techniques and appeals that writers, speakers, and producers use to try and persuade or convince us of things. So there's some terms that we're going to need to know. We'll write them onto the page that you have in your packet, page 3 and 4. But also, we want to record our thinking. So this is something that we're going to come back to. We'll be using again in a couple of different ways, and you will have a quiz over it, which will be open notes. So all the notes that you take on this are going to be really helpful a little bit later on. So quick, pause the video, go get yourself something to write with, and grab your Unit 5 packet. Okay, if you're back, let's take a look at the types of things that we're going to be writing on this page and on this article. The directions are right at the top of the page, and it tells us that we want to show some evidence of close reading. So the first thing that we're going to do is define any unfamiliar terms. And you're going to see as this video, as you watch it and read along with me, I'm going to be doing that as well. So if we run across any unfamiliar words or words that I know are going to be coming up a little bit later on, you're going to see me define them. But I want to encourage you that along the way, if there are other words that you see in this article that you're unfamiliar with, pause. Take a moment to define them because I'm sure that you will see them again. So if you want to look them up, make some notes on your page, please do so. The other thing I want you to make notes of are any time that you have questions. So if there's a spot in the text that doesn't quite make sense, or if you're like, hey, I'm not quite sure what this is referring to, mark that in the text. Make a note of it in the margins of your pages so that we can come back to it and get some of those questions that you have answered. The other piece that you want to do is any connections that you can make. So maybe you've taken debate before and you know all about Aristotle and you know about the different types of appeals. You know what the terms logos, ethos, and pathos means. Maybe those are some connections that you can make to this particular article. And if you haven't heard those terms and you've got questions about them, don't worry, you're going to get them answered. Finally, if you see anything that stands out to you, if you like the wording of a sentence or there is an interpretation that you can make based on your reading here, those are things that you're going to mark. So the directions right at the top of the page here tell us how we're going to be going about doing some close reading. So let's get started. The article is titled, What is Rhetoric? And it comes from Annie Olson. Notice it says excerpt, which tells you it's not the full article. We've specifically chosen a chunk of this article that we feel would be a good introduction to some basic concepts of rhetoric. So it's not the full article, but it is linked on our classroom space if you want to read the full thing. So this one is titled, What is Rhetoric? And it comes from Annie Olson, who is a professor. She writes, recently, I sent a group of students out to ask that question, though the question being that of the title, What is Rhetoric? Each student asked 10 people to define rhetoric, and each student returned with 10 completely different answers. Not surprisingly, more than half of the answers had negative connotations. So you can see I've actually already gone and defined connotations in the margin here. Connotations is definitely one of those words that you've probably heard, and we're going to be using quite a bit as we're going through and talking about rhetoric. So words have their dictionary definitions, which we call denotations, dictionary denotation, but they also have connotations, which are the feelings that we tend to associate with a word. And in this case, she's saying that people have oftentimes negative connotations or negative feelings about that word rhetoric. So I might write myself a little note in the margin that connotations is the feelings that we associate with the word. So I'm wondering, like, why do people have a negative association with the word rhetoric? Let's see if she explains that. People who are deceived and lured by hype are sometimes described as having succumbed to the rhetoric. If politicians make promises they don't keep, those promises are likely to be criticized as empty campaign rhetoric. And while it's true that rhetoric can have negative connotations, that is, rhetorical skills can be used to deceive or to sway people unethically, these conceptions of rhetoric are misleading and fail to even scratch the surface of what rhetoric is all about. So she kind of explains that sometimes we associate it with like hype or misleading, or it's unethical, or politicians. And so that's why we might have some negative understandings of what rhetoric is. So you'll notice I highlighted in purple. It's already bolded, but I wanted it to stand out even more. The definition of rhetoric that she gives us. She says, during the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric. So Rhetoric's italicized, so we know it's the book title, in which he defined rhetoric as discovering all available means of persuasion on a topic. So rhetoric is about how we are persuaded. It's the techniques that writers and speakers use to convince us of an idea or of an argument. So thus, for Aristotle, rhetoric has a clear persuasive function, but also an epistemic function. That's a load of word there. That's a big mouthful. So epistemic comes from the Greek root epistemology, which is the study of how true something is or how valid it is. So epistemic function is like referring to how like true or how valid the function of it is. So it's a type of study. It serves as a way to discover what is known and what can be known about a subject. Oh, look at that. I didn't even have to define it. I just had to keep reading because she defined it for us right there. That's what epistemic function is. So she goes on to say, every time we use language in speech or in writing, we engage in a rhetorical act. Ooh, that means everything we say or do in some way, shape, or form is like trying to convince someone, right? Either ourselves or other people. I kind of like this. I'm going to write myself a little note in the margins so that everything that we say, everything that we do, like even what I'm doing right now, I suppose, is a form of rhetoric. Everything is rhetoric or part of the rhetorical act. I wonder if she's going to explain that a little bit more. I mean, that would be a question that I'm wondering about. Another way of saying this would be to say that all communication is rhetorical. Whenever we use language, we have an intention, a message to communicate, or a goal to achieve. Look at that. I just had to keep reading. She defined it for us. She told us about that idea of like how communication and all communication is a rhetorical act. All of us behave rhetorically every time we use language. In fact, a useful modern definition of rhetoric is simply the intentional use of language to influence the audience. So notice it's bold and italicized. So it's, again, kind of like she's showing us visually on the page that this is something that we might want to remember as a definition to kind of come back to. And then, hey, I want to point something out. You see these 3 little dots here, right? The ellipses. If you ever see that in a text in the middle of a paragraph like it is here, it means that something's been cut out. So this is where I, as your teacher, there's a whole other like section that went a little bit more in depth into the Greek background. I didn't think we needed it, at least not right now. So I just cut that out. So that's why this article that you're reading is an excerpt. If you see those 3 little dots, that's what that means. So she goes on to explain some more specific terms, and these are things that we're going to use in our class too. One useful way for us to think about rhetoric now is to understand that every rhetorical act, meaning every use of language, occurs within a rhetorical context that includes 4 elements. So I'm going to highlight this right here because this is what she's defining. She's defining the rhetorical context, meaning like how and when language is persuasive. So first we have aim, which is the speaker or the writer's goal, the effect that you want to have on a specific audience. And then you have your audience, which is the specific person or group of people that you're addressing. You have the medium, so the method of delivery, whether that's a newspaper flyer, radio or television broadcast, poster, letter, speech, academic paper, etc. And the subject, the topic of the rhetorical discourse. So discourse just means conversation or speech. So I'm just going to write myself a little note to find that. So discourse, so the rhetorical conversation being had. And this part's interesting, and I like how she defines this because it's actually something that we're going to use a little bit later too, because you can do this kind of like we did soapstone analysis before with the poetry to help you unpack like why someone is putting together a particular piece. So think about it this way. You are going to be putting together a mini documentary about someone or something in Granville that's iconic. And if you think about what your goal is in terms of these four, like the rhetorical context of putting that together, it helps you better understand why you're doing something and why you're choosing like particular ways of filming or particular ideas that you want to share or writing or voiceover or music. So, right, if our aim is to share some information about an iconic Granville person, then I'm trying to educate, right? That would be my aim. And then I want to think through like, who would be my audience for that? Am I sharing that with just my teacher? Am I sharing that with my class of CTAL 10th grade students? Do I want to share that with an audience who maybe isn't familiar with Granville? Am I sharing this with an audience maybe on the web or someone who is not familiar with like the history or the people or the community of Granville? It's different the way that you're going to put together a piece based on who your audience is. Your medium or how like the format that you put it together in is also going to change the style, right? Like if I had just given you directions on the page and said, hey, read this, that's one form of rhetoric. The medium would be then just reading the handout. But I'm doing this via video. So the way that I am like using my language right now to convince you to read along with me, I'm not just using the words on the page, but you can see me, you can hear me do some more explanation. So it changes how we're putting things together. So unpacking that rhetorical context helps us understand a whole lot more about how something is or isn't persuasive. She goes on to say that to be an effective speaker or writer, you must begin to analyze the rhetorical context of your discourse. So kind of like what we just did. Why are you speaking or writing? To whom? How will your message be delivered or received? What is your message about? These factors exert significant impact on what you will say or write and how you will say or write it. Suppose, for example, that you wanted to quit a job that you currently have and take a new job. You might explain your reasons to your friends and or your parents quite differently than you would to your current boss. Maybe you tell your friends or your parents that you hate your job or that you don't get paid enough or that you think your boss is an idiot. You would probably express yourself quite differently to your boss if he or she asked for your reasons, especially if you wanted a job reference for your next employer. This is just one example of how the factors of the rhetorical context work together to influence what is written or said and how. And that's the key. This is the key. Rhetoric is about not just what is said, but it's about how. So within the rhetorical context, we, as speakers and writers, make three types of appeals to our audience. And so this little chart here, which is on page 4 of your packet, is going to break down a little bit more about what you heard me say earlier in this video: ethos, logos, and pathos. So we have different types of appeals that build some credibility, build some evidence, and help us be more persuasive. And Aristotle broke it down into this, what we call a rhetorical triangle that's built around ethos, logos, and pathos. So let's figure out what these terms mean. Ethos is the Greek word from which we get ethics. So ethos is all about your credibility, reliability, and authority as a speaker and as a writer. Oof, I love that. So ethos is built around like how you come across. Do we believe why you're saying what you're saying? That's your ethos, or building an appeal to ethos. So it has to do with your credibility. Essentially, ethos is your reputation with your audience and the strategies that you use to convince your audience that you should be believed or be taken seriously. For the Greeks, who put a great deal of emphasis on citizenship, ethos has a lot to do with the rhetors, so that's like the speaker, the rhetor's status in the community. In fact, Quintilian, a Roman rhetorician, defined ethos as a good man speaking well. For Quintilian, being a good man is equally as important as having the ability to speak well. Ethos focuses on you as the speaker or the writer. Oh, I love this. So I'm just going to write myself a note in the margin of my paper. So ethos is how credible or how believable, let's do believable, how believable the speaker is. Why should we believe the speaker? Logos then, logos sounds a lot like our word logic, and that's a good way to think of logos. Logos focus on the text itself, the data, examples, statistics, facts, reasoning, etc., which are part of your message. We often refer to the logos portion of the writing as the support material. So this is sort of how we logically support our ideas. So logos then, logos equals how we logically arrange support. So our support, and I love that they have here the different things like data, examples, statistics, facts, but I don't want you to think that logos is just numbers, because logos can also be like anything that you use to appeal and support your idea. So sometimes the things that we find most supportive are not numbers, but stories. So personal anecdotes or short stories are perfect examples of an appeal to logos, where you're trying to build an appeal towards an argument by supporting it using stories or anecdotes. Naturally, a speaker or a writer who uses poor or faulty data to support a claim or convince an audience compromises his or her ethos or his or her credibility. Like if you use bad info, we don't believe you. In other words, these rhetorical appeals don't exist in isolation. Oh, I love this. Because so oftentimes, like students and young writers want to talk about like, this is an appeal to just logos, or this is an appeal to ethos. And it kind of doesn't work that way. You have to have all three of these things at once. They kind of dance together, right? So I like this, and I'm highlighting it, and I'm just writing all three, logos, ethos, and pathos, which we'll get to in a second, work together. I like that, work together. They are closely interrelated. Nonetheless, when we talk about logos, we're focusing primarily on the text or the message that's being delivered. Last one, pathos. Hey, that's our root word of the week, path, meaning feeling. So our modern English word, which is closest to pathos, is pathetic. We tend to use the word pathetic to describe someone that is pitiful, stupid, or sorry, but the root word path, hey, look, do we get extra credit? Because this literally is our word of the week this week, means feeling or suffering. We derive quite a few medical and psychological terms from this root. So for example, that's what EG means. For example, pathology, pathologist, psychopath, all of those, because those terms have to do with what human beings feel and or suffer. So pathos is all about appealing to human emotions, feelings. Thus, pathos is on the audience. This is what we were talking about last week, right? So that when you watch particular advertisements, some make you laugh, some make you cry. Like remember we watched the ASPCA commercial with the dog and the sad piano music. Like those are appeals to our emotions. So pathos or path is an appeal to our emotion. And those are powerful things, right? We are moved as human beings by our emotions, not always by logic. So appeals to emotions is what I'm going to write, just so I remember that there. So then we're almost done with our article. Aristotle believed that the most significant of the appeals was ethos, that someone will be believed because of his or her reputation or charisma, even if the facts of the message are weak. This may explain why people who run for office undergo extensive training on how to relate to people to develop public charisma. Aristotle believed that ideally people wouldn't be persuaded by logos, but he acknowledged that most people were swayed by what we feel and care about than by what we believe to be factual. Hey, I just said the same thing. A skilled writer understands that all three appeals work together within a specific rhetorical context and uses all of them to accomplish his rhetorical aim. Now that we do so much of our reading and writing online, we're paying a lot more attention to the fact that the visual elements of text are equally as important to the language of the text in communicating meaning. These are two tools that speakers and writers use to make three rhetorical appeals: language and image. So one of the things that we're going to need to spend some time talking about is this big, bold question right at the end of the article. So given what you've read and annotated, how might you define digital rhetoric? What elements make up digital rhetoric? So if you think about finding images on social media or reading online or watching a video like this, how is the rhetoric that I'm using right now different from maybe just print or hearing me speak in person? Like, how is digital rhetoric? How could we define that? And how is that different? Because ultimately, we're going to be using some digital rhetoric to put together those videos. So we need to unpack and understand how not just writers and speakers